Madam President, I listened with great attentiveness to the comments of the very distinguished Chair of the Judiciary Committee, who I have the utmost respect for. But I feel like I must respond given this important question that is not before this body, but should be. I think the first point I would make is the term lame duck is being used rather loosely. Lame duck, as I have always understood it, is the period between the election and the swearing in of a successor. A lame duck Congress is the Congress between November and January. A lame duck president is the president between November and January. I think, as I've always understood the use of that term, to apply it to a president who's in the middle of the early part of the fourth year of his or her term, I think is not an accurate characterization or usage of the term lame duck. The distinguished chairman said, we are going to have a debate. I'm delighted to hear that. The question is when. The question is when. Now, I wasn't here in 1992. I wasn't here in 1987. I wasn't here in 2007. So I'm trying to figure out how to respond to this situation, how to understand the situation with reference to the Constitution. Now, there are lots of provisions in the Constitution that are subject to windy law review articles, to lengthy court decisions, to interpretation, to characterization of what they actually mean, what was the original intent of the framers, and all of those complicated issues of discussion, dissection, and explication. But the word for, as in 1, 2, 3, 4, and the word shall, as in shall do something, are not among those confusing terms. I would submit, Madam President, that the President has a constitutional obligation to submit a nominee to this body, and this body has a constitutional obligation to consider that nomination. Not an obligation to confirm, not an obligation to say yes, but an obligation to consider it. The presidential term is 4 years. It is not 3 years and 1 month. That's in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 2 says the president shall nominate ministers, judges, and justices and judges of the Supreme Court with the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, I would not for a minute presuppose what the decision of the Senate should be. But to argue that the Senate will not even hear the nomination, will not discuss it, will not debate it. In fact, some of the members have said they won't even meet the person with no knowledge whatsoever of who this person is. The president may nominate a person who's a combination of Aristotle, Thomas Jefferson, and St. Thomas Aquinas, but he's not even going to be met with, he or she. I don't understand that as a matter of interpretation of the Constitution. And there's a lot of discussion about the people should have a role in this decision. The Constitution makes that clear, that they do have that role when they elect the President of the United States for a 4-year term, not for a 3-year and 1 month term. So I can see no wiggle room on the President's obligation to submit a nominee to this body. And this decision to stonewall this nomination, to not meet with the nominee, to not hold hearings, to not hold a debate, to not hold a discussion, has profound implications for the court, because the reality is this will mean the court will be without a justice for essentially 2 terms. We've lost Justice Scalia. In February, the term of the court doesn't end until later this spring. He will not be present for the final decision-making on matters that have been before the court this term. And then if we wait until a new president comes in January 20th, 2017, submits a new nomination almost immediately, let's say it's within the first 2 weeks of his or her taking office, the average time for consideration of a justice is between 60 and 90 days, so we're into February, March, April. That's toward the end of the next term of the U.S. Supreme Court. So by delaying this decision, we are basically saying we're going to leave the court without a justice in contravention to the explicit provision of the Constitution for what amounts to 2 terms. Now, again, I want to be very clear. I am not saying that there is any constitutional obligation on this body to approve the president's nominee, but I believe there is a constitutional obligation to consider that nominee. And that's really what we're debating here, and I'm delighted to hear the distinguished chairman say we're going to have this debate, but we ought to have it now under the Constitution, which requires the president to submit a nominee, and I would argue requires this body to at least consider that nominee, to hold hearings, to let the people hear who the nominee is, what their views are, and to make the decision in this body whether or not this nominee should be approved for this incredibly important, august, and solemn obligation to undertake as a justice of the United States Supreme Court. So, again, for and shall are not debatable propositions. Whether or not the Senate should confirm is clearly within the discretion of every senator in this body. But to say that we will not have the opportunity to make that decision, I think is contrary to the Constitution, is contrary to the best interests of the American people. And I'm surprised, frankly, that my colleagues are taking this position because nobody's saying how they have to vote. If they don't like the nominee, they can vote them down. But why not have a hearing? Why not have a debate? Why not have a discussion? Why not find out who this person is? It may be, the president may nominate someone who is of great appeal to both sides of this body. So I would hope that the distinguished chair of the committee would reconsider his decision and the committee's decision to not even hold a hearing and to carry out what I believe is the obligation to at least hear the nomination, not approve it, but to at least hear it, and therefore let the American people participate in this discussion. But let's also follow the explicit provisions of the Constitution that require the president to submit a nominee, and I believe require us to at least consider it, if not approve. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.